Today, we received news that our economy had 0% inflation in the month of July. 0%. Here's what that means. While the price of some things went up last month, the price of other things went down by the same amount. The result, zero inflation last month.
I don't agree at all. And first of all, what zero represents is Joe Biden's understanding of the U.S. economy, because he has no clue what's going on. You can't brag about the fact that we had one lone month where high prices didn't get any higher. It's not like they went down, they just didn't go up. But if people were struggling with high prices, their struggle didn't get any easier in the month of July. It remained the same. What would have been good is if prices could have come down, but they didn't come down. And in fact, the only reason that the headline number didn't go up was because we finally got some relief at the pump. Gas prices came down, but a lot of other prices, food prices keep going up, rents keep going up. In fact, you mentioned the core, which doesn't include energy, was up 0.3 on the month. So if you annualize that, multiply it by 12, that's still a pretty decent sized number. Yes, it's not quite as huge as the numbers we've been getting, but there's always going to be an ebb and flow in these numbers. I mean, how many times last year did all these analysts, including people in the government, claim that we had peak inflation? I mean, I got sick and tired of hearing peak inflation back in 2021. I had to keep saying we're nowhere near the peak. And the same thing applies today. Yes, we may have hit a temporary peak. Maybe it'll take a few more months before we see a year-over-year increase that's higher than the 9.1 that we got in June. But there's no doubt in my mind that we will get a higher number than 9.1. We are nowhere near done with this inflation problem. It is going to be here for years and years and years, probably the remainder of this decade, and probably then some. And, so just looking at one-off month where, we didn't get a big rise and having this premature victory dance, I think is an insult to the American public. As they keep telling us, this is a very unique recession. In fact, most people don't even want to admit that we have one. But, look at the recessions of the 1970s. You had rising prices there, during stagflation, and that's what my forecast is. Remember, last year, I was predicting the U.S. economy would be in recession in the first half but I also predicted that inflation wasn't transitory, that it would get stronger as the economy got weaker, and that is exactly what happened. Now, the reason that I believe that inflation is going to kick into a higher gear as this recession that we are in gets worse is because I believe Powell is going to pivot ultimately, and he is going to give up his fight against inflation in order to fight a different foe, and that is going to be a recession and rising unemployment and potentially a financial crisis, either one that has already happened or one that is rapidly approaching. And so I think Powell is going to choose what he believes to be the lesser of the two evils, and I think he's going to pick fighting recession and propping up financial markets and monetizing government debt so the Treasury doesn't have to default. I think the Fed is going to pick that over inflation. And so unlike the pivot that we got with Volcker back in 1982, where Volcker pivoted after a victory in his fight against inflation, Powell is going to pivot despite defeat. Inflation is going to win. And so when we go back to 0% interest rates or whatever we do, and when we go to QE5, which is going to be launched, I don't think the Fed is going to shrink its balance sheet very much. It's going to shrink it less than it did last time it tried to do it, which is an impossible task given the bubble that it's inflated. I think when the Fed goes back to stimulus and creating inflation, when inflation is maybe double or triple or quadruple that 2% target, the markets are going to react very differently than how they reacted in the past. Because in the past, the Fed was able to justify all this cheap money because they said we don't have enough inflation, we're still below target. Well, when they go back to this stimulus, when inflation is triple or more their target, the markets aren't going to buy it. And so I think all the inflation that they are going to have to create in order to stimulate the economy out of this recession is going to ignite a powder keg. We already have an inflation problem, and Powell's going to pour all this gasoline on it. And so we're going to see inflation moving up to a much higher level, even though it's already very high. In fact, it's probably double what the government claims in the CPI. If you want to know what's actually happening to prices, you've got to double what the government tells you, and that's more accurate. We can't have a soft landing because a soft landing means we avoid recession. So by that definition, we've already crashed. I'm not going to change the meaning of a word just to deny that we're not in something that we're in. But the point of that tweet is you have all these Keynesians that somehow believe that inflation is caused by economic growth. They also think it's caused by too many people working. They think there's a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. They think if there's not enough people unemployed, you're going to have more inflation. And the way to get rid of inflation is to put people out of work. All of this is Keynesian nonsense. Inflation is not caused by the private sector. It's not caused by growth. It's not caused by people working. The only people working that cause inflation are the people at the Fed who are running the printing presses, who are pushing all the buttons that are creating all the money. That's where inflation comes from. And they create inflation in order to monetize U.S. government debt. So the federal government runs a big budget deficit. The Federal Reserve prints up money to buy those bonds, and that inflation enters the economy. It's got nothing to do with growth or people working. As a matter of fact, in a real economy, the stronger the growth, the lower prices. Because what is economic growth? It means increased output. It means more goods and services are being produced. Well, if you increase the supply of something, then you decrease the price. So a productive economy that's producing more stuff means that the price of that stuff is lower. The same thing with people working. If more people are employed productively, their productive output is increasing the supply of goods and services, keeping the prices down. If you slow down real economic growth, if you force people out of work, you're going to have less supply. We're not going to make as much stuff. We're not going to be offering as many services. And so therefore, the prices of those goods and services, all else being equal, are going to go up. Supply creates demand. So if people are producing and putting goods and services into the economy, well, now they have the ability to share in that production. They've earned money helping to create stuff, and now they could spend that money to buy the stuff that they created. And so the demand that comes from real production doesn't cause prices to go up. The only kind of demand that causes prices to go up is when the government just prints money and gives it to people. And so that money is not a function of production. People didn't earn that money producing. They just were sent the money by the government. I mean, that's what happened during COVID to a huge degree. You had people who had jobs and were working to help make stuff. They went home. They weren't working at all. They weren't making anything. But now the government sent them money. They weren't earning money because they worked. They were being paid not to work. But the worst part about it was many people were paid 2 or 3 times not to work than what they earned when they were working. So now these people who weren't working at all had all this money to go and buy stuff, but they didn't help produce any stuff. That's what pushed up prices, because you had all this fake demand and no supply. You see, the proper monetary policy response to the pandemic, if everybody was going to stop working, the Fed should have shrunk the money supply, not expanded it. The U.S. government should have cut spending, not spent more. That would have balanced out supply and demand. But instead, we had the worst combination of monetary and fiscal policy probably in the history of the country in the face of collapsing supply. And so we're experiencing now, I think, just the beginning of those consequences. We've got a long way to go, which is why the idea that inflation has peaked is nonsense.